Our story begins with an old man named Paddy, a weathered soul who spent his days patrolling the quiet streets of his small town. One evening, when he returned home from his daily rounds, he was met with an unexpected visitor, his son, Tom. It had been 14 long years since they'd last seen each other, but Tom wasn't there to reconcile. He was there to confront. Years ago, Paddy's addiction to alcohol had turned him into a violent man, one who had beaten Tom's mother mercilessly. That trauma had driven Tom to leave with his mother and never look back. Now, standing before the father he once feared, Tom listened as Paddy swore that he'd quit drinking, that he was no longer that man. But Tom's eyes held no trust. "Some stains," he said, "never wash away." Before leaving, he asked about his brother Brendan, a name that instantly stirred old guilt in Paddy's heart. Then the scene shifts. Brendan, Tom's elder brother, is seen celebrating his daughter's birthday alongside his wife Tess. The room is filled with laughter and warmth, but beneath the smiles, there's tension. Tess is upset. She's spent more than they could afford on the party. Brendan tries to calm her, but she reminds him that every dollar counts. Soon, she heads out for her night shift, determined to balance their fragile finances. Meanwhile, Tom walks into a local gym where a televised announcement catches his attention. An upcoming international MMA tournament called Sparta, where the winner would take home a staggering $5 million. The thought sparks something inside him. Without hesitation, Tom signs up for the gym's membership. Inside, a cocky fighter known as Mad Dog was taunting everyone, easily humiliating challengers. The coach, Colt, clearly frustrated, shouted, $200 to anyone who can take on Mad Dog. That was all Tom needed to hear. Calmly, he stepped into the ring. Within moments, he dismantled Mad Dog with brutal precision. Not a wasted move, not a second spared. The crowd fell silent, and Tom walked out with his reward money, but more importantly, with a glint of purpose in his eyes. Across town, Brendan was in a classroom teaching physics to his students. His quiet, disciplined life, a sharp contrast to Tom's. After class, he met with his financial advisor, who gave him devastating news. If he didn't clear his bank loan within 4 weeks, the bank would seize his house. Brendan's face fell. On his modest teacher's salary, even 4 months wouldn't be enough to pay that debt. That evening, desperate and cornered, he called Tess to say he was heading to a club for a part-time job as a bodyguard. But in truth, Brendan wasn't going to guard anyone. He was going to fight. Years ago, he'd been a skilled fighter, but he'd given it up when Tess entered his life, promising her he'd never step into a ring again. Yet here he was, stepping into the underground cage once more. The rule was simple. The longer you lasted, the more you earned. Driven by sheer necessity, Brendan fought round after round through the night, earning bruises and blood in exchange for survival. When he finally stumbled home the next morning, Tess took one look at him and knew. The cuts, the bruises, they told the story he tried to hide. Her eyes filled with hurt, but instead of anger, she whispered softly, "I can lose this house, Brendan, but I can't lose you." Meanwhile, Tom had made his decision. He went to see Paddy again, the father he despised but needed. He wanted to train for the Sparta tournament, and he needed Paddy to be his coach. Because despite all the bitterness between them, there was no one who knew fighting better than Paddy. Tom's decision was made. He wanted to fight in the Sparta tournament, and for that, he needed the best. Swallowing his pride, he turned to the one man he'd never thought he'd ask for help, his father, Paddy. When Tom asked him to be his trainer, the old man's eyes softened. For the first time in years, he felt like a father again. "If this is what brings me closer to my son," he said quietly, "then I'll do it." Before the training began, Paddy made one thing clear. There would be no drugs, no substances, no shortcuts. He made Tom hand over every pill, every vial, every trace of his addictions. Only then would he agree to train him. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Brendan arrived at school, only to find whispers spreading through the hallways. Every student, every teacher was talking about him. Overnight, a video of his underground fight had gone viral, and now everyone knew that their physics teacher was actually an MMA fighter. The principal summoned him immediately. "You never mentioned this in your resume," he said sternly. Brendan tried to explain that it was just a desperate act to save his home, but the principal didn't listen. With a cold expression, he handed Brendan a suspension letter. Crushed, Brendan returned home and told Tess everything. His voice trembled as he said, Maybe I have no choice but to keep fighting, even in those small, low-level matches. It's the only way to keep this house." Tess's heart sank. She hated the idea of him getting hurt again, but she also knew how desperate their situation was. She said nothing, only watched him walk away into the night. Brendan went to see his old friend and former trainer Frank. "I need you to train me," he said. Frank sighed. "Brendan, you've been out of the cage for years. I can't train you full-time. I already have Marco preparing for Sparta, but I'll help you as much as I can. Brendan nodded. Even a little hope was enough. That night, when Brendan returned home, he found his father standing outside his door. The sight of him brought no warmth. Patty smiled faintly and said, "It's been 1,000 days since I last touched a drink," but Brendan's face stayed cold. "And what does that do for me, Dad? What do I get out of it?" he said bitterly. Patty hesitated, then revealed softly, "Your brother's back. Tom's here. I'm training him." Those words hit Brendan like a punch to the chest. "Of course," he muttered, his voice trembling with anger. "Train your favorite son. You never trained me, remember?" He slammed the door in Patty's face, leaving the old man alone in the night. The next day at the gym, Coach Colt called Tom over. "Your fight with Mad Dog went viral," he said with a grin. "Sparta officials saw it. Congratulations. You're officially in." Tom couldn't believe it. The moment he stepped outside, he called someone. Not family, but a promise. On the other end was the widow of his fallen comrade from the army. Years ago, when his friend had died in battle, Tom had promised to take care of his wife and kids. And now, his goal was clear: win the Sparta tournament and give them the $5 million. Training began, brutal, relentless, unforgiving. Sweat, pain, and discipline became Tom's new world. At the same time, Brendan was training with Frank in every spare moment he could steal. Then, fate intervened. During a sparring session, Frank's top fighter, Marco, suffered a severe injury. The doctor shook his head. "He's out. No way he can compete." As Frank stood there, disheartened, Brendan saw an opening, his one chance to rise again. "Frank," he said, "let me take Marco's place. Let me fight in Sparta." At first, Frank refused. "It's too dangerous, Brendan. You're not ready." But Brendan didn't back down. He needed this for his family, for his pride. Finally, Frank sighed and said, "All right, I'll talk to the Sparta organizers." The next day, Frank called with the news. "Congratulations, Brendan. You're officially in the Sparta tournament." But the celebration was short-lived. When Tess found out, she was furious. Her face turned pale with fear and anger. She knew what that tournament meant. Brutal, professional fighters who didn't stop until their opponents were broken. She looked at him and whispered, "You're going to die in there, Brendan." Tess's fear was real. Her voice trembled as she tried to reason with him. "Brendan, you don't understand. This isn't some small-town fight. These are professionals. Men who break bones for a living. You could die in there." But Brendan just took her hand gently. "Hey," he said with quiet certainty, "nothing's going to happen to me. I promise." His eyes carried both love and desperation, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. Days passed, and soon, the Grand Sparta tournament arrived, the biggest MMA stage in the world. Fighters from across the globe gathered, each one hungry for that $5 million prize. The arena thundered with cheers, lights blazed down, and cameras caught every breath, every heartbeat. Amid the chaos, Brendan's eyes fell on someone he hadn't seen in years. Tom, his own brother. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the arena floor, but Tom didn't flinch. He looked straight through him, his face cold, unreadable, and then turned away. 14 years of silence hung between them like a wall of ice. For Tom, the wound had never healed. He still blamed Brendan for walking away from the family, for leaving him and Patty behind. His anger ran so deep that he couldn't even look at a picture of Brendan's family without rage burning in his chest. And then the bell rang. The tournament had begun. Tom's first fight was announced, and the crowd roared his name. The war hero! Cameras zoomed in, commentators whispered stories of his military past, but no one really knew how powerful he was inside the cage. Tom walked toward the ring with no walkout song, no sponsors, no entourage, just silence. His presence alone was enough to shake the air. The moment the fight began, he exploded like a storm. One punch, a single, clean, thunderous hit, and his opponent crumpled to the floor. Tom didn't even wait for the referee's count. Shido, he turned his back and walked out of the cage, knowing exactly how deadly his punch had been. And he was right. The opponent never got back up. Then came Brendan's turn. His opponent was fast, ruthless, and far more experienced. The first round was brutal. Brendan took hit after hit. His defense faltered, his movement slow from years away from fighting. The crowd winced as his opponent locked him into a chokehold, but Brendan refused to tap. He held on until the bell rang, his face red, breath short, but his spirit unbroken. As the second round began, something inside him ignited, a surge of focus, of willpower born from love and fear and survival. He struck back with precise, relentless power, eventually locking his opponent in a flawless armbar. The man screamed, tapped out, and the crowd erupted. Everyone was stunned. How could a quiet physics teacher defeat a top-tier fighter? The commentators were speechless. And far away, Tess's phone buzzed with the notification. Brendan Conlon wins his first fight. She gasped, tears welling in her eyes, and rushed to turn on the TV. From that moment on, she couldn't look away. Fight after fight, Brendan continued to surprise everyone, his calm, calculated moves earning him victory after victory. The teacher fighter, they called him now. Meanwhile, Patty visited Tom in the locker room between matches. "Son," he said softly, "you've been fighting with hate in your heart. What are you trying to prove?" But Tom stayed silent. The truth was darker than pride. He had been discharged from the army for saving a fellow soldier's life instead of following combat orders. His own comrades had labeled him a liability, and that betrayal had hardened him. Now, fighting was all he had left. Soon, the commentators announced that only 4 fighters remained: Brendan, Tom, Koba, and Mad Dog. The tension was electric. Tom's next match was against none other than Mad Dog, the same man he had humiliated in the gym weeks ago. As soon as the bell rang, Mad Dog began taunting him, throwing insults, trying to provoke him into losing control. But Tom didn't waste words. He let his fists speak, and within seconds, the ring became a storm. Tom's punches were cold, precise, and devastating, the kind of hits that made crowds gasp and opponents crumble. He dismantled Mad Dog with brutal efficiency, barely breaking a sweat. The audience roared. The commentators screamed his name, and Tom, calm as ever, walked out of the cage again. With that victory, he had secured his place in the finals. And waiting for him there was someone he never expected, his own brother. But before the world could witness the long-awaited final, one more battle stood in the way. A fight that everyone was waiting for. Brendan versus Koba. Koba, the undefeated monster. No one had ever taken him down. His reputation alone was enough to send shivers through even the toughest fighters. The crowd erupted as he entered the arena. Massive, unshakable, a human wall of muscle and fury. And there, walking toward him, was Brendan, the quiet teacher who had shocked the world by making it this far. Even Tess had come to watch this time, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what Koba was capable of, and what was at stake if Brendan lost. The bell rang. Within seconds, Koba charged like a bull. He grabbed Brendan, lifted him high into the air, and slammed him to the ground like a sack of flour. The audience gasped as Brendan was tossed from one side of the cage to the other, each hit echoing like thunder. The first round ended with Brendan barely able to stand. Round 2 began, and it was more punishment. Koba's power was terrifying. Suplex after suplex, Brendan's body crashed onto the mat again and again, his vision blurring, breath short, but still, he refused to quit. Between rounds, Frank leaned close to him, voice low but firm. "Listen, kid, you fight smart in this 3rd round, all right? But if I think your life's in danger, I'm throwing in the towel." Brendan nodded weakly, pain etched across his face, yet his eyes burned with determination. The 3rd round began, and this time, Brendan shifted his focus. Instead of trading blows, he waited, watched, looking for that one small mistake. And when Koba overextended on a strike, Brendan seized the moment. He caught Koba's arm, twisted it, and locked in a perfect armbar. Koba roared in agony, trying to break free. The pressure was unbearable, his face contorted in pain. There were only 2 choices now: let his arm snap or tap out. And for the first time in his career, Koba tapped. The crowd exploded. Brendan had done the impossible. The teacher had defeated the giant. He had earned his place in the finals. And his opponent, his own brother Tom. The audience was stunned as the commentators broke the revelation. Both finalists are brothers. The crowd gasped. No one had known, because Tom had taken his mother's surname years ago. It was a secret buried under years of silence, now uncovered in front of the entire world. The final match began, and from the very first second, Tom came at Brendan like a wild animal. His punches were savage, raw emotion fueling every blow. Brendan tried to defend, but Tom's rage was unstoppable. Hit after hit landed, and by the end of the first round, Brendan was bleeding, staggering, barely holding on. In the corner, Frank spoke quickly. "Listen to me. You can't match his power. Just tire him out. Make him chase you." When the bell rang again, Brendan did exactly that. He dodged, circled, forcing Tom to waste his energy. But Tom, relentless as ever, kept swinging, attacking from every angle. The crowd watched in tense silence as Brendan struggled to stay alive in that cage. Then, with a sudden burst of clarity, Brendan saw his opening. He slipped behind Tom and locked in his signature move, the armbar. But Tom didn't tap. He gritted his teeth, refusing to give up. Brendan tightened the hold, and with one final twist, Tom's shoulder dislocated with a sickening pop. The crowd gasped. Brendan froze. Tears welled in his eyes as guilt crashed through him. He hadn't wanted this. Not against his own brother. He whispered through choked breaths, "I'm sorry, Tom. I'm so sorry." The bell rang again. Tom's arm hung uselessly at his side, yet he refused to quit. Limping, trembling, he raised his other fist. ready to keep fighting. The audience stood in stunned silence as the two brothers faced each other, one broken, the other crying. From the sidelines, Paddy watched, his heart shattering. He gestured faintly toward Brendan, eyes filled with pain. A silent plea, Brendan understood. As tears streamed down his face, he took hold of Tom once more, whispering, "I love you, brother. I'm sorry," and locked in the chokehold. This time, Tom didn't resist. His strength faded, his breathing slowed. He heard his brother's sobs echoing in his ears. And finally, with trembling fingers, he tapped out. The bell rang. The match was over. Brendan had won, but victory had never felt so heavy. As the announcer declared his name, Brendan didn't raise his hands. He turned to his fallen brother, knelt down, and wrapped him in his arms. Tom didn't fight back. He leaned against him, broken, exhausted, but finally at peace. Two brothers, once torn apart by anger, now united in pain, forgiveness, and love, stood in that cage as the crowd erupted around them. The war was over. Brendan held his brother tightly, helping him out of the ring as the crowd roared in awe. It was no longer about victory or defeat. It was about two broken souls finding their way back to each other. Paddy stood near the cage, his eyes glistening with pride and relief. For the first time in years, his family was whole again. The pain, the anger, the distance, all of it dissolved in that single embrace. So tell me, how did this story make you feel? Did it hit your heart the way it did theirs? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this moment touched you even a little, let's see if we can reach 1,000 likes together. For every heart that believes love always finds its way back.